Welcome to Jesus Changes Everything, a daily podcast dedicated to providing a fresh look at the ancient and glorious truth that Jesus not only reigns, but is busy about the business of bringing all things under subjection, that celebrates the wonder and the glory that he has been given all authority in heaven and on earth. This morning I had the privilege of addressing the men of the local chapter here in Fort Wayne of an organization called the New Canaan Society. The New Canaan Society is not an attempt to rebuild the pagan cultures of Canaan that Israel drove out, but rather it's named for a city in Connecticut where this organization started. And it's not that unusual of a gathering, because what it is a group of men, Christian businessmen, who gather together for mutual encouragement and strengthening once a week. And I've been going to these meetings now for, 3 or 4 years, and very much enjoying them. And today I was invited to speak to the group because next time they meet, they will be beginning a new study on a new book that all the men are being asked to read. It's a short little book. It's a book that I will be giving a brief overview of here in just a moment in our next segment. But I wanted to give you an overview today, right now, of the things that I spoke with them about today, because like a lot of organizations of its kind, this particular organization tends to feel like, or tends to take the position that in order for these men to be of service to one another, to bless one another, to enjoy unity, they have to set aside issues of doctrine and instead focus on Jesus. And I came into this meeting to say, no. I understand, I think, what they're trying to get at, and in fact, I appreciate what they're trying to get at. I think what they're trying to get at is that let's not allow secondary distinctives to divide us. The fact that you believe in a dispensational eschatology and I believe in a postmillennial eschatology should no way divide us whatsoever. I agree and I appreciate that. But that doesn't mean that we should steer clear of the study of theology. It's not a great insight to point out that when someone says, I don't believe in doctrine, I just believe in Jesus, they are A, affirming a doctrine, and B, disagreeing with Jesus. Because Jesus himself calls on us to cultivate sound doctrine. He does this through his apostles, who in their epistles enjoin us and to be careful against faulty doctrine and to develop good doctrine. So why do we have that kind of perspective? Well, I think that at the end of the day, it's because we've been listening to the devil instead of the Bible. Now, again, and I said this morning, I'm perfectly willing to agree that a person can have all manner of theological knowledge and be a wreck, be outside the kingdom, be a burr under the saddle of the church. All of those things can be the case. I'm not saying that a deeper understanding of theological issues or a wider understanding of theological issues will solve everything that ails us. But I'd also say that that's true of anything we want to put in its place. And that, in fact, a sound understanding of theology is part of what we're called to do. And, in fact, handled rightly can be profoundly powerful. That was the gist of my message, to say to these men who were about to engage in a reading of a tiny little book written by a very successful, popular, and yet very brilliant theologian who goes by the name of R.C. Sproul, not R.C. Sproul Jr., but R.C. Sproul. They're going to be reading one of his books, and I wanted to take the opportunity to say, hey, guys, look. This is a chance for you to change this about yourself. This is an opportunity for you to recognize that God calls us to know Him, to study His Word, to study what it says about Him, about us, about how we relate, and that these things actually do have a deep and a profound impact on our spiritual status and our spiritual growth. Now, in the context of this talk, I told this true story about my father and me. When I was 5 years old, my father served as minister of theology and evangelism at a local church. These 2 years that he was at this church were the only 2 years over the space of his first 35 or so years of ministry where he was on the staff of a local church. And that was his role, minister of theology and evangelism. And I mentioned to the man, of course, that probably seems a little odd to you. You probably think those are two different kinds of people, that the minister of evangelism is a guy out active on the streets talking to people, and the minister of theology is in his ivory tower. Well, no. That's not what good theology leads you to, an ivory tower. It leads you out into the streets. Well, in his role as minister of evangelism, my father thought it would be wise and prudent to learn a thing or two about evangelistic methods. And at that time, there was a relatively new, relatively unknown, but still already showing signs of great success, evangelistic method being taught out of a church in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, which church was Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church, pastored by Dr. D. James Kennedy, and the program is called Evangelism Explosion. And so my father, in his early 30s, travels down to Fort Lauderdale to learn more about this and brings back what he learns to College Hill Presbyterian Church in Cincinnati, Ohio. And soon he is leading teams, going door to door, equipped with these two, what would you call them, diagnostic questions that was so integral to the Evangelism Explosion program, where you were instructed to speak to the unbeliever and say, now, have you come to the place in your life where you're convinced that if you should die, you would enter into heaven? And whether the person says yes or no, the next question is, if God were to stand before you and say, why should I let you into my kingdom? What would you say? And this reveals where the person's hope is. Well, before taking it to the streets, my father thought it would be prudent to test it out. And lo and behold, who should be there ready to be the guinea pig but 5-year-old me? He said, son, come here. Let me ask you a question. I said, yes, Daddy. He said, if you were to die today, do you think you'd end up in heaven? I said, oh, yes, Daddy. He said, and if you were to stand before God and God were to ask you, why should I let you into my kingdom? What would you say? And I remember looking at him like just dumbfounded that this man that I looked up to, that I thought was such a genius, would ask such a stupid question. And I answered him with disgust in my voice. Well, I'd tell him, because I'm dead. And that was me. 5 years old, believing in justification by death alone. You see, that's bad theology. I'm happy to report that by God's grace, I've gotten past it. And I have come to believe that we're justified by faith alone, in Christ alone. But I also understand that that's something a little bit different from justification by believing in justification by faith alone. I'm not saying anybody's falling for that, but I can see how it would be a temptation. I can see people thinking, well, I know the right answer to the question. But you know who else knows the right answer to the question? The devil does. The question is, what are you relying on? What are you resting on? And that is a theological question. It's also a personal question. And friends, every personal question should be a theological question, and every theological question, lo and behold, should be a personal question. When we look at theology as a field of study, as a body of knowledge that we're supposed to learn, or we're supposed to avoid learning because it might divide us, either way, we're doing it wrong. What we're supposed to be doing is learning about who God is. We're supposed to be drawing nearer to Him. We're supposed to be equipping ourselves for a greater celebration of His glory, a deeper rest in His provision, a deeper humility about our need. Those are the things that come out of the study of theology, and then those same things should come out of us in how we live our lives. That's why we've been doing this new segment that we call The Gospel at Work. I want to talk to people and ask them, how does this knowledge, how does this experience of being rescued, how does it impact your behavior at work? How does it impact your relationships with those you work with and those you work for and those who are your customers? Because if it doesn't impact there, then it doesn't impact anywhere. You can't separate Jesus from your life and ask Jesus to save your life. Well, that's what I talked about this morning. It was a blessed opportunity. And I'm looking forward to seeing how the men do interacting with this book that we will be talking about in our next segment. So just what was that book that you were talking about? It can be hard to narrow things down when I'm talking about my father's books, since he's written more than 100 of them. This particular book is a very, very brief one and part of a 30-book series that is called Crucial Questions. Each of these is probably less than 100 pages, and even those pages are probably, 6 by 4, maybe 7 by 5 at the most. And this particular book that the men of New Canaan Society are going to be reading here in the Fort Wayne chapter is called Can I Be Sure I'm Saved? Can I be sure I'm saved? And it is a very helpful book, of course, and it exhibits those very qualities that make what my father does. That is, it's sound, it's biblical, it's historical, and it's easily understandable. He takes that profound gift that he's always had of taking some things that might seem complex and making them understandable without making them simplistic. He always used to say, if you can't explain it to a 7-year-old, you probably don't understand it yourself. Well, here he is weighing in on an issue that is of profound personal interest to millions of believers. I mentioned at this meeting that the question that I get asked about more often than any other by far is precisely this question. It might take a different form. Hey, I'm afraid I've committed the unpardonable sin. How can you help? It may be, hey, I'm not sure that my faith is a saving faith. How can you help? Or it can be any number of different things where people are, how can I know if I'm elect? Any number of different ways that people struggle with this uncertainty. And of course, it's a pretty important question, isn't it? I mean, there is no question in all of reality to which the answer has such a radically diverse outcome. If I'm in, it's paradise forever. If I'm not in, it is torment forever. So I get that this is a profoundly important question, and that's why it's worth taking the time to look at what the Bible has to say about these things. Here are, just in the few minutes that I have, here are a list of theological issues that touch on the issue of assurance. 1, how are we saved? 2, what is the relationship between faith and works? 3, what is my nature before I come to saving faith? 4, does regeneration, is that something that I do, or is it something that God does? What does 5? What does sanctification look like in a man's life? That's just right off the top of my head. Don't even have any notes on it. That's how immediate and clear and connected all of these things are. And by the way, the Bible speaks to all 5 of these issues, and it does so in a coherent, consistent way, in a way that can help us. But there's another principle here that I don't want you to lose sight of, and it's simply this is something, again, that I told these men. Not only do I want you to read this little book from my dad, I want you to read your Bible. Because if the Bible is anything, it's not just a story that explains that God is sovereign, or that explains how we have peace with God, or that explains the relationship between faith and works. It is a book that from page 1 to the last page and every page in between shows us our failure and God's provision. Page 1, we sin, and God shows up to rescue us. Page 2, we sin, and God shows up to rescue us. And all of a sudden, assurance, just like salvation, becomes less of an issue of what am I doing or what can I do, and more of an issue of what has God done and what has God promised. You see how this little 90-page book is a great place to start a theological education for the sake of remaking us into the image of the Son, for the sake of sanctifying us, for the sake of our growing in grace and wisdom, and for the sake of the peace in our hearts. If your theology doesn't impact you, you're doing it wrong. If you are creating your theology, you're doing it wrong. I encourage you to check out this little book from R.C. Sproul, Can I Know for Sure That I'm Saved? Let me also, while I have your attention, encourage you as well, on a related note, to go out and check out today's Ask RC podcast. You can find that on YouTube on the R.C. Sproul Jr. channel. And today's particular podcast, 5-minute podcast, answers this question: how can I help my Bible reading have a deeper impact on me? I think it'll fit very nicely with what we've just been talking about. I encourage you to check it out. And while you're there, leave a like and a comment and subscribe. Just think of it as a bonus segment of Jesus Changes Everything. It's there every day that Jesus Changes Everything is there. It's just not out on all the same channels, so to speak. So check it out, Ask RC on YouTube, and as always, let us know what you think. You've been listening to the Jesus Changes Everything podcast, a production of Dunamis Fellowship, the teaching outreach of Dr. R.C. Sproul Jr. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we encourage you to subscribe, which you can do at all the usual outlets, to tell your friends, and to spread the word. To learn more about the work of Dunamis Fellowship, please visit rcsproulJR.com and join us next time on Jesus Changes Everything.